The lobby clock read 4:17. I had the marriage certificate in my left hand and my driver's license in my right. Caroline was at the check-in desk, cream linen dress, that laugh she does where she throws her head back. The desk clerk said, "Welcome, Mrs. Thorne," and handed her a key card. I tapped the certificate against my palm. She turned. Her face did what faces do when you see a ghost that has your husband's name. I walked up and put both documents on the marble counter. That woman is using my name. The reservation is under my married name. This is my ID and this is my certificate. Dear Job. The clerk's name tag said Mark. He was 22. He called security on a hotel phone. Caroline said Elena like it was a question. I said no. You don't get to say my name. The lobby had 27 people in it. I know because I counted. A woman near the bar held up her phone. Caroline grabbed the key card and tried to walk toward the elevators. Security caught her before she made the turn. The champagne was still in the bucket. I kept it. 2 glasses. They'd ordered 2 glasses. Someone was supposed to join her. It started, as most things like this do, on a Tuesday. Tuesday afternoons I used to clean out my inbox. I know how that sounds. The kind of woman who schedules her own betrayal discovery. Peter was in Dallas for a closing. He'd been doing a lot of Dallas lately. Too much for a firm that had 3 associates who could handle Dallas. I told myself he was indispensable. He told me the same thing. I found the phone on the nightstand. His work phone. He'd left it charging while he ran out for coffee. We'd been married 25 years. I'd never looked at his phone. Not once. That's not something I say for moral credit. That's just how it was. I didn't need to look. I knew where he went, who he called, when he came home. I knew the rhythm. That phone was not a mystery to me. It was the one place I didn't have to go. But he was in Dallas. And the phone was here. And it buzzed. Caroline's name. Not a text. An email. The screen lit up enough for me to see the subject line. Hotel confirmation. My thumb hit the screen before my brain caught up. It was one of those stupid muscle memory things. You hold a phone and your thumb just moves. I was still holding it when the screen unlocked. It didn't even ask me for his passcode. It was his work phone. He didn't lock it. The email was from the hotel's reservation system. Confirmation number. Dates. A suite. The Honeymoon suite. Under my name. Elena Thorne. Peter's corporate credit card on file. A note in the special requests field. Champagne on arrival. 2 glasses. I read it 3 times. My name. His credit card. Caroline's email address. There was no way to misinterpret it. You can't misinterpret your own name. I put the phone back on the nightstand. I went downstairs and made coffee. I drank it black. Peter always put cream in mine. That morning I didn't. I sat in the kitchen and watched the sun come up over the fence in the backyard. Our backyard. The one I designed. There was a fountain I'd had shipped from Italy. Peter thought it was extravagant. I told him the house needed a center point. It had a center point. It was about to lose it. The next 2 days were ordinary. I went to work. I met with a client about a hotel renovation in San Antonio. I looked at tile samples. I approved a purchase order for custom millwork. I did all the things that Elena Thorne does. I didn't call Peter. I didn't confront him. I waited. That's the part people don't understand about women my age. We know how to wait. Not because we're passive. Because we've learned that timing is everything. Confrontation is a weapon. You don't fire it until you're sure you'll hit what you're aiming at. I found this second confirmation on his desktop computer. He'd left it open. The browser had a tab for a burner email address. Caroline had sent him the reservation again. With a smiley face. A yellow smiley face at the end of a sentence that said, "Can't wait to see you." I took a screenshot. I sent it to myself. I deleted the sent message from his outbox. I cleared the browser history. Then I sat in his office chair and looked at the wall of framed law degrees and thought about how easy it is to destroy someone who trusts you. I called the hotel. It took me 5 minutes to confirm that the reservation was active and that the suite was ready for check-in at 4 o'clock on Thursday. I told the front desk manager I was Mrs. Thorne and I'd be arriving early. I asked if the champagne would be chilled. He said it would be. Then I called Margaret Chin. Margaret was not my divorce attorney then. She was my lawyer for other things. Business contracts. A dispute with a vendor once. She handled my will. She'd been my attorney for 8 years. I trusted her with money. I trusted her with my signature. I had never thought about trusting her with my marriage. She answered on the second ring. Elena. Is something wrong? I said. I need you to tell me what happens when I separate my assets from my husband's. There was a pause. Margaret is not the kind of lawyer who fills silence with reassurances. She lets the pause tell you things. She's 58 and she's seen more marriages dissolve than I've seen sets of window treatments. She said, You're asking me about Peter. Yes. Can you tell me why, or do you want me to work blind? I told her. Not the whole thing. Just the reservation. Just my name. Just the date. She said the hotel is on his corporate card, you said. Yes. Then his firm is going to want to know about that. I assumed. Margaret didn't ask if I was sure. She's never asked me that. She asked what I wanted to do first. I said I wanted to go to the hotel. I wanted to be there when Caroline checked in. I wanted to be the one holding the paperwork. She said, Elena, that's not strategic. That's theatrical. I said, I know. She said, Do you understand what you're starting? I said, yes. She said, Call me after. I hung up and went to my closet. I chose a gray dress. Not black. Gray is more honest. I didn't do my makeup. I wanted to look exactly like what I was. A woman who had just found out her husband of 25 years had booked a honeymoon suite for another woman under her name. I wanted that to be the image. I took the marriage certificate from the safe. It was in a fireproof box with the house deed, the car titles, and our daughter Lily's birth certificate. I looked at Lily's birth certificate for a minute. She was 23. She lived in Portland. She didn't know anything. I put the certificate in my bag. Then I added my driver's license. Then I added my passport. Then I added my business card. I had no idea if any of it would matter. I just knew I wanted to be able to prove who I was. The drive to the hotel took 18 minutes. I know because I timed it. I left early. I got there at 3:49. I sat in the parking garage and waited. I didn't listen to music. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel and watched the minutes change. At 4:05, I saw Caroline's car pull in. A silver BMW convertible. The same one she'd bought after she closed the deal on that downtown condo. She'd called me to tell me about the commission. We'd had lunch to celebrate. I got out of my car. I walked to the lobby. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me. I thought I would be. I thought there would be shaking or nausea or something. There wasn't. There was just the concrete floor of the lobby and the sounds of suitcases on wheels and the air conditioning and the woman at the front desk who had no idea what was about to happen. Caroline was at the check-in desk. She was wearing that cream linen dress she'd bought at that boutique on South Congress. She'd shown it to me. She said, Do you think this is too much for a work event? I said, It's beautiful. Buy it. She bought it. She was wearing it now in my hotel with my name, checking in for my honeymoon. I walked up. I put my documents on the counter. I said what I said. And then I watched it happen. The clerk's face went through 5 stages in about 2 seconds. Confusion. Recognition. Alarm. Action. He was good at his job. 22 years old, and he knew exactly what to do. He said, Ma'am, can you step aside for a moment? He said it to Caroline. He picked up the phone. He said, I need security to the front desk. He said it like he'd been trained. I appreciated that. Caroline said, This is a misunderstanding. I said, No, it's not. She said, Elena, please. I said, You don't get to say my name. I already told you that. She grabbed the key card. She tried to walk toward the elevators. She was fast. I'll give her that. She was across half the lobby before security came through the side door. 2 men. Badges. The kind of men who don't smile. They caught her at the elevator bank. She was pressing the button. One of them said, Ma'am, you need to come with us. Caroline said, I have a reservation. The other one said, The reservation is not in your name. I walked over. I had the champagne bucket in my hands. I'd taken it from the desk. The clerk didn't stop me. I was holding it like a purse. A ridiculous image. I didn't care. I said, Caroline, I have your email. I have the confirmation. I have the text messages on his phone. I have everything. This is the only time I'm going to warn you. Walk out with them or I will make sure every real estate agent in this city knows why you got a divorce. She stared at me. Her face was white. She didn't say anything. She just let security take her. One on each side. They walked her through the lobby, past the bar, past the woman with the phone, past a family with 2 kids and a stroller, past a man in a suit who lowered his newspaper to watch. The revolving door turned. She was gone. I don't know what happened to her. I didn't watch. I went back to the front desk. I said to the clerk, I'm keeping the champagne. He said, yes, ma'am. I said, the room is still under my name. I want to keep that too. He said, of course. I said, but I'm not staying tonight. I'm just waiting for my husband. I took the key card. I sat down in one of the lobby chairs. I put the champagne bucket on the table next to me. I waited 45 minutes. That's how long it took Peter to show up. He walked through those revolving doors like he owned them. He had his lawyer face on. The one he uses when he's about to bill someone. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at the champagne. He looked at the empty lobby. He looked at the woman behind the bar who was pretending not to look at him. He said, what happened? I said, your girlfriend got a free ride to the parking garage. Security was very helpful. He said nothing. He looked at the people near the bar. 3 of them had phones out. One of them was still filming. I said, 2 glasses. They'd ordered 2 glasses. Someone was supposed to join her. He turned and walked out. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. No nothing. He walked through the revolving doors and he was gone. I stayed in the chair. I opened the champagne. I poured myself a glass. The woman at the bar was still pretending not to watch. I raised the glass to her. She didn't raise back. I called Lily. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said, how was your day? She said, fine. I said, your father is going to call you tonight. I need you to decide what you want to hear from him. There was a long pause. She said, Mom, what happened? I said, he booked a hotel room for Caroline. She said, Caroline. Not a question. Just the name. Like she'd known it was possible. Like she'd been waiting for me to say it. I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just need you to be ready. He's going to have a version of this. She said, I don't want his version. I said, I know. She said, are you okay? I said, I will be. I hung up. I finished the champagne. I left the bottle on the table. I went home. The house was quiet. It's always quiet when Peter is gone. The kind of quiet that used to feel like peace. Now it felt like waiting. I walked through every room. Kitchen. Dining room. Living room. His study. Our bedroom. I opened his closet. I looked at his suits. Brooks Brothers. All of them. Gray, navy, charcoal, black. I knew them all. I knew which one he wore for depositions, and which one he wore for court appearances, and which one he wore when he wanted to look like he hadn't tried. I closed the closet door. I went to the guest room. I pulled his clothes out of the closet and put them on the bed. I didn't fold them. I didn't sort them. I just moved them. Then I went to the bathroom and got his toiletries. Razor. Shaving cream. The expensive hair product he'd been using since he turned 50. His toothbrush. The mouthwash that smelled like cinnamon. I put everything in a duffel bag. I put the duffel bag in the hallway. Then I called Margaret. She answered on the 1st ring. Elena. I said, it's done. She's out. He knows. She said, how did he take it? I said, he walked out. She said, he'll come back. I said, I know. She said, have you thought about what you want? I said, I want the house. I want our savings separated. I want him to know that I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. She said, that's not a divorce plan. That's a preliminary list. I said, I don't know if I want a divorce yet. I just know I want him to understand what he did. She said, he won't understand it from you. He'll understand it from the papers. I said, then send the papers. She said, I need to know what you're asking for. I said, I'll send you a list. She said, Elena, you need to think about the recording. I'd forgotten about the recording. 3 days ago. Before everything. Caroline came to the house. She'd said she wanted to talk about her son's graduation party. She'd sat in the kitchen. I'd made coffee. We'd talked for 40 minutes about catering and invitations and where to set up the tent. Then I'd said, "Caroline, are you sleeping with my husband?" She'd laughed. She'd laughed and said what I'd said, "Don't lie to me. I have enough evidence to know the answer. I'm asking you to tell me yourself." She'd looked at me for a long time. Then she'd said, "Yes, but it's not what you think." I said, "What is it then?" She said, "We're in love." I said, "You're not in love. You're using him." She said, "That's not true." I said, "Then what are you doing with him?" She said, "He's unhappy." You know he's unhappy. I'd had my phone in my hand. I'd turned on the recording app. I don't know why. I'd never done that before. It wasn't planned. It just happened. My thumb had hit the button while she was talking. I said, "That recording isn't going anywhere." Margaret said, "It's evidence." I said, "It's leverage. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But I know I'm not going to use it yet." She said, "Do you want me to send the separation papers to Peter's office or to the house?" I said, "The house. I want him to open them here. With me." She said, "That's risky." I said, "I know." She said, "I'll have them sent tomorrow." I hung up. I went to the kitchen. I made myself a sandwich. I ate it standing at the counter. I didn't taste anything. Then I went to the guest room and I lay down on the bed. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and I counted the minutes until morning. Peter came back the next day at noon. He used his key. I heard the front door open. I heard his steps in the hallway. I heard him stop when he saw the duffel bag. Then I heard him walk toward the guest room. He opened the door. I was sitting on the bed. I'd been sitting there for an hour. He said, "You moved my stuff." I said, "I didn't want you to have to pack." He said, "I'm not leaving." I said, "You have a hotel reservation. I thought you'd want to use it." He didn't say anything. He stood in the doorway. He was wearing a navy suit. The one with the faint pinstripe. The one I'd bought him for our 22nd anniversary. I said, "You wore that suit to the closing in Dallas, didn't you?" He said, "Elena." I said, "You wore it to see her. You wore it to the hotel." He said, "It wasn't like that." I said, "What was it like then?" He said, "I don't know how to talk to you about this." I said, "Then don't talk." "I don't want you to talk. I want you to leave." He said, "I'm not leaving. This is my house too." I said, "It's not. The house is in my name. I signed the papers when we refinanced. You remember. You were too busy to come to the closing. You signed a power of attorney. I was the one who went to the title office. The deed is in my name only." He stared at me. I saw it land. I saw him remember the day. He'd been in court. He told me it was fine. He told me to just handle it. I'd handled it. He said, "You never told me that." I said, "I didn't think I had to. It's always been my house. You just lived in it." He stepped back. He looked at the duffel bag. He said, "Where am I supposed to go?" I said, "I don't care." He said, "I don't have anywhere to go." I said, "That sounds like a you problem." He left the doorway. He walked back to the front door. He didn't take the duffel bag. He just left. I heard the door close. I heard his car start. I heard him drive away. I stayed on the bed. I didn't move. I just sat there in my guest room, on the bed that was now the only bed I was going to sleep in, and I thought about what came next. 3 days passed. I didn't hear from him. I didn't call him. I went to work. I met with my clients. I approved tile samples. I talked to contractors. I did my job. I came home. I ate dinner alone. I watched television alone. I went to sleep alone. Lily called me every night. She asked the same questions. Was I eating? Was I sleeping? Was I okay? I said yes to all of them, even the ones that weren't true. On the 4th day, I did laundry. I took Peter's clothes out of the duffel bag. I'd left it in the hallway. I was going to donate them. I was going to put them in bags and take them to the shelter and never think about them again. I opened the duffel bag. I pulled out his suits. I pulled out his shirts. I pulled out his slacks. Then I pulled out his coat pocket. There was a box in it. A small blue velvet box. I knew what it was before I opened it. I'd seen enough of them in the movies. I opened it anyway. There was a ring inside. A diamond. Not huge, but not small. The kind of ring you give to someone you plan to marry. The kind of ring you give to someone who is not your wife of 25 years. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about Caroline wearing it. I thought about Peter asking her to marry him. I thought about the divorce he'd have to get first. The divorce from me. The divorce I hadn't filed. I closed the box. I put it back in the pocket. I took a picture of the box on the dresser next to Peter's watch. The watch I'd given him for our 20th anniversary. The watch he still wore. He still wore the watch. That was the part one couldn't figure out. I put the box back in the duffel bag. I zipped the bag. I put it in the front hall closet. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat down and I called Margaret. I said, he has a ring. She said, for her. I said, yes. She said, does he know you found it? I said, no. She said, you need to decide what you want to do with that information. I said, I want to know when he's going to use it. She said, you can't wait for that. You need to move first. I said, I know. She said, the separation papers went out yesterday. He'll get them today. I said, good. She said, Elena, if you want to use the recording, now is the time. I said, not yet. She said, he's going to respond to the papers. You need to be ready. I said, I am. I wasn't. Not really. I was ready for him to be angry. I was ready for him to beg. I was ready for him to deny. What I wasn't ready for was the silence. For more days. He didn't call. He didn't come back. He didn't send a lawyer. Nothing. It was the loudest silence I'd ever heard. I went to work. I came home. I ate dinner. I slept alone. I kept waiting. And then Caroline's sons found me. They sent me messages on Instagram. Both of them. Separate accounts. The older one, Tyler, was 26. He worked in finance in Dallas. The younger one, Justin, was 23. He was in grad school. I'd known them since they were in middle school. I'd been to their birthday parties. I'd bought them graduation gifts. I'd watched them grow up in the same house where their mother had been my friend. Tyler's message came first. It was just a screenshot of a video. I didn't need to watch it. I knew what it was. The lobby. The revolving door. The woman in the cream dress being escorted out. The caption said, anybody know what this is about? It had 80,000 views. I typed back. I'm sorry you had to see that. He said, is it true? I said, what did your mother tell you? He said, she said it was a misunderstanding. I said, it wasn't. He said, what happened? I said, she was checking into a hotel room that was reserved under my name. The room was with my husband. She knew. There was a long pause. Then he said, I don't know what to say. I said, you don't have to say anything. He said, are you okay? I said, I'm fine. He said, I'm sorry. Justin's message came an hour later. He said, my mom told me you set her up. I said, I didn't set her up. I showed up. He said, she says you planned it. I said, she's wrong. I just didn't stop it from happening. He said, I don't know who to believe. I said, you should believe her. She's your mother. You should believe what she tells you. But you should also know that she had an affair with my husband for over a year. She knew what she was doing. She knew who she was hurting. And she did it anyway. He didn't respond. I closed the app. I didn't block them. I didn't need to. They weren't the enemy. They were just collateral. The same way my daughter was collateral. The same way we all were. I went to work. I had a meeting with a developer named Rachel. She was the one who'd told me years ago that I was too accommodating to Peter's schedule. I'd brushed it off. I'd said, he needs me to be flexible. She'd said, he needs you to be invisible. I'd laughed. I'd said, that's not true. She'd said, okay. The way people say okay when they know you're not ready. Rachel's project was a hotel in San Antonio. Boutique. 20 rooms. A full renovation. She wanted me to lead the design. She'd sent me the contract the week before. I'd told her I'd look at it. I'd been too distracted to look at it. I looked at it now. $90,000. 18 months. Full creative control. I signed it with a pen that was sitting on my desk. I signed it without reading the fine print. I didn't care about the fine print. I just wanted to sign something that was mine. Rachel called me after she got the signed copy. She said, I wasn't sure you were going to take this. I said, why not? She said, you've been distracted lately. I said, I've been busy. She said, Elena. I heard about the hotel. I said, it's a small city. She said, do you want to talk about it? I said, no. She said, okay. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. I said, thanks. She said, you're welcome. And Elena, I'm glad you signed. I think you need something that's just yours right now. I said, I know. Peter's response to the separation papers came through Margaret on the 10th day. He'd hired a lawyer. A man named David Grant. I knew him. He'd been to our house for dinner twice. He'd brought his wife. A sweet woman named Claire. I'd made lamb chops. Peter had grilled. They'd stayed until 11. We'd all had too much wine. I remembered Claire saying, you two are so lucky. 20 years and you still look at each other like that. I remembered Peter smiling. I remembered thinking he was smiling at me. Margaret said David is going to contest the property division. I said, on what grounds? She said, he's arguing that the house was a marital asset regardless of the deed. He's arguing that you signed the power of attorney under duress. I said, under duress. I was at the title office. By myself. I signed a piece of paper. It was the most boring afternoon of my life. She said he's also arguing that Peter's firm gave him the credit card and the reservation was a work expense. I said he booked a honeymoon suite. He wrote honeymoon in the notes. She said, I know. I'm telling you what they're saying. I'm not telling you I agree with them. I said, what do I do? She said, you wait. They've made their argument. We make ours. It takes time. I said, how much time? She said, months. Maybe longer. I said, I don't have months. She said, you have whatever it takes. That's how it works. I hung up. I sat in my office. I looked at the tile samples on my wall. I looked at the millwork drawings on my desk. I looked at the signed contract for the San Antonio hotel. I thought about the ring in Peter's pocket. I thought about the recording on my phone. I thought about the house that was mine. I thought about the money I'd already moved. I opened my banking app. I looked at the account. 40% of our joint savings. It was in my name only. I'd done it the morning after I found the email. I'd gone to the bank. I'd told the teller I was transferring funds for a business purchase. I'd signed the form. I'd walked out. Peter wouldn't know for 72 hours. That was the bank's policy. 3 days. I'd had 9. I looked at the balance. It was a lot of money. It was enough to live on for a year. It was enough to pay my attorney. It was enough to start over. It wasn't enough to make him hurt. But it was enough to make him notice. He noticed. He showed up at my office the next day. I was in a meeting. My assistant came in and said, Peter is here. I said, tell him I'm busy. She said, he says he's not leaving. I said, then he can wait. I finished my meeting. I talked about bathroom fixtures for 45 minutes. I didn't rush. I didn't look at the clock. When I was done, I walked out to the reception area. Peter was sitting in a chair. He was wearing jeans. He didn't wear jeans. Not ever. I'd bought him those jeans for his birthday 3 years ago. He'd said they were uncomfortable. He'd never worn them. He was wearing them now. I said, you're wearing the jeans. He said, what? I said, you're wearing the jeans I bought you. You said they were uncomfortable. He looked down at himself. He looked back at me. I didn't know what else to wear. I said, you could have worn your suits. They're still in the closet. He said, I'm not staying at the house. I said, I know. He said, I'm staying with David. I said, that's fine. He said, I need to talk to you. I said, we have nothing to talk about. He said, we have everything to talk about. You filed papers. You transferred money. You had a conversation with my firm. I said, I didn't have a conversation with your firm. Margaret did. He said, same thing. I said, no, it's not. Margaret works for me. Your firm works for you. They're not the same. He said, you're trying to destroy me. I said, I'm trying to protect myself. There's a difference. He stood up. He walked toward me. I didn't step back. He stopped about 3 feet away. He looked at me like he was trying to find something. Maybe he was looking for the wife he used to have. Maybe he was looking for an opening. He said, I made a mistake. I said, you made 1,000 mistakes. The first one was thinking I wouldn't find out. He said, I didn't want to hurt you. I said, then you shouldn't have done it. He said, I don't know what to do now. I said, you can start by leaving my office. He said, Elena. I said, I'm not going to do this here. If you want to talk, we can talk through the attorneys. That's the arrangement. He said, I don't want that arrangement. I said, I don't care what you want. He stood there. I waited. Then he left. He walked out of my office and he didn't look back. I went back to my desk. I sat down. I didn't move. I just sat there, looking at the tile samples on the wall, and I thought about how good it felt to say no. The next morning, I went to Caroline's brokerage. I'd never been there before. I knew where it was. It was in a building downtown. Glass and steel. Very modern. The kind of building where agents have their names on the doors. Caroline's name was on a door. I'd seen it in photos. I'd never walked through it. I walked through it now. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I said no. I'm here to see Caroline. I'm a friend. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't care. I gave my name. The receptionist made a call. A few minutes later, Caroline opened her door. She looked terrible. The cream dress was gone. She was in a black blazer and gray pants. Her hair was pulled back. She'd lost weight. Her face was pale. She looked at me like I was a ghost. I said, I need to talk to you. She said, you need to leave. I said, I'm not leaving. She said, there's a security guard in the lobby. I said, call him. I'll tell him why I'm here. She stepped back. She let me in. I walked into her office. It was exactly what I expected. White furniture. Abstract art. A view of the city. A desk with nothing on it except a laptop and a framed photo of her sons. I looked at the photo. I looked at her. I said, you need to stop this. She said, stop what? I said, you need to stop trying to take my husband. She said, I'm not trying to take him. He wants to be with me. I said, he wants to be with someone who makes him feel like he's young. That's not you. That's anyone. You just happen to be there. She said, you don't know anything about our relationship. I said, I know you had sex in my house. She said, that's not true. I said, I know you sent him emails from a burner account. I know you called him from a second phone. I know you met him in Dallas. I know you checked into a hotel under my name. I know everything. And I know you don't love him. You love the idea of taking something from me. She sat down. She looked at her hands. She said, that's not what happened. I said, then what happened? She said, he came to me. I said, he came to you because you were there. Because you made yourself available. Because you made him feel like he was special. She said, he is special. I said, he's a man. He's a man who is bored and insecure, and you gave him an excuse to act like he was someone else. That's not love. That's convenience. She said, you don't understand. I said, I understand everything. I understand that you've been competing with me for 18 years. I understand that you couldn't stand the fact that I had something you didn't. So you tried to take it. She looked up at me. Her eyes were red. She said, you have no idea what I've been through. I said, I don't care what you've been through. I care about what you've done. And I'm telling you to stop. She said, what are you going to do if I don't? I said, I have a recording. She said, what? I said, the conversation we had in my kitchen. When you admitted it. You told me you were in love with him. You told me he was unhappy. You told me you didn't care what I thought. She said, you recorded me. I said, yes. She said, that's illegal. I said, I don't know if it's illegal. I know you can't destroy it. I know your brokerage would like to know that one of their agents is sleeping with a married man whose firm she's used to get listings. She said, you wouldn't do that. I said, I would. I absolutely would. If you don't walk away from him, I will send that recording to every ethics committee in this city. I will send it to the real estate board. I will send it to your sons. You think I won't. You think I'm too nice. I'm not nice. I'm done being nice. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me. I stood up. I walked to the door. I said, you have 1 week. Get out of his life. Or I destroy yours. I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear her crying through the door. It was the last sound I needed. 1 week. That's what I gave her. 1 week to walk away. I didn't expect her to do it. I didn't expect anything from her. But I wanted her to know that the clock was ticking. Peter didn't call. He didn't come to the house. He didn't send any more messages through David. The silence from him was louder than anything he could have said. I went to work. I went home. I talked to Lily. She called every night. We talked about her job and her boyfriend and the apartment she was thinking about moving into. We didn't talk about Peter. We didn't need to. She knew. She'd known for weeks. She'd known before I did, I think. She'd seen it in the way he stopped asking about her. She'd heard it in the way he answered her calls. She was waiting for me to tell her. And when I did, she said, "I'm not surprised." That hurt more than anything. I was in the kitchen on the 5th night. I was making dinner. A simple thing. Pasta. A salad. I was eating alone. I was used to it by then. The house felt smaller without Peter in it. Not smaller in a bad way. Smaller in a manageable way. The rooms were mine. The furniture was mine. The silence was mine. The doorbell rang. I didn't check the camera. I just opened the door. It was Peter. He looked different. He was clean-shaven. He had his suit on. The navy one. The one I'd bought him. He was holding a folder. He held it out to me. He said, "I need you to look at this." I said, "Come in." He walked in. He went to the kitchen. He sat at the table. The same table where we'd had dinner for 25 years. The same table where Caroline had sat and confessed to me. I stood in the doorway. I watched him. He said, "Please sit." Saturday he said, "David put together a proposal." I said, "What kind of proposal?" He said, "A settlement. Something that lets us both move on." I said, "I didn't know you wanted to move on." He said, "I don't. But I don't know how to fix this." I said, "There's nothing to fix. You did what you did. I know what you did. That's not something you can fix." He said, "I know." He opened the folder. He slid it across the table. I looked at it. It was a proposal. A legal document. David's letterhead. It said, "Proposed Asset Division." I read it. He was offering to give me the house. He was offering to give me the car. He was offering to give me 60% of the savings. He was offering to pay for Lily's wedding if she ever had one. He was offering to walk away. I said, "This is generous." He said, "I want this to be over." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I can't keep doing this. The waiting. The not knowing." I said, "You think I'm the one who's been waiting?" He said, "No. That's not what I meant." I said, "Then what did you mean?" He said, "I meant I'm tired. I'm tired of being the one who did everything wrong." I said, "You did everything wrong." He said, "I know." I said, "You had an affair. You used my name. You bought her a ring." He said, "You found the ring." I said, "You left it in your pocket." I do your laundry. I always do your laundry. You didn't think I'd find it, he said. I thought you'd stopped doing my laundry. I said, I didn't stop. I just stopped telling you I was doing it. He sat back. He looked at me. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, 3 weeks before the hotel. I found the email. The confirmation. The one you sent to your burner account. He said, "I didn't send it to a burner account." I said, "You did." I saw it. He said, "I don't have a burner account." I said, "You do. It's on your computer." I saw the tab. He stared at me. He said, "I don't have a burner account." I sent the confirmation to Caroline's email. That was the only email I used. I said, "That's not what I saw." He said, "You must have seen something else." I didn't say anything. I was thinking. I was thinking about the email. The screen. The subject line. The burner account. I'd assumed it was his. I'd assumed he'd set it up to hide his tracks. But he was telling me he didn't. And I believed him. He was a terrible liar. He always had been. The only reason I hadn't caught him before was because I hadn't been looking. He said, "Elena, what did you see?" I said, "I saw an email from Caroline. A confirmation. It was sent to an account I didn't recognize." He said, "That wasn't my account." I said, "Who was it?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Then someone else knew." He said, "What?" I said, "Caroline. She sent the confirmation to someone else. Someone who was supposed to be there." He said, "No. The reservation was for me and her. No one else." I said, "Then why did she send it to a second email?" He didn't have an answer. I watched him try to find one. I watched him fail. He said, "Maybe she was being careful." I said, "Maybe she wasn't." I picked up my phone. I opened the browser. I looked at the history. I'd cleared it the day I found the email. But I hadn't cleared my search history. I searched for the burner email address. The one I'd seen on his computer. It came up. It was a Gmail address. The username was CLH_4th. I said, who is CLH? He said, what? I said, CLH. That's the username. Who is it? He said, I don't know. I said, you don't know the initials of the woman you've been cheating on me with. He said, her middle name is Laurel. Her first name is Caroline. That's CLL, not CLH. I said, then who is H? He stared at the screen. He stared at the username. He said, I don't know. I said, someone else was involved. Someone with the initial H. He said, that's not possible. I said, then who sent the email? He didn't answer. I looked at him. His face was white. He was afraid. Not of me. Of something else. Something he didn't know about. I said, Peter. Who else knows about the reservation? He said, no one. Just me and Caroline. I said, then how did this get sent to someone else? He said, I don't know. I said, think. He thought. He thought for a long time. Then he said, Caroline has a sister. Her maiden name was Henson. Her middle name might be something with an H. I don't know. I said, her sister's name is Holly. He said, what? I said, her sister's name is Holly. She mentioned her once. They're not close. He said, why would she send it to her sister? I said, I don't know. But I'm going to find out. I opened my messages. I sent a text to Tyler, the older son. I said, is your aunt's name Holly? He responded in 2 minutes. Yeah. Why? I said, no reason. Thanks. I looked at Peter. I said, she sent the confirmation to her sister. Her sister's initial is H. He said, why? I said, I don't know. But I'm going to find out. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to call Holly. He said, you don't know her. I said, I'm going to meet her. He said, Elena, this is getting out of control. I said, this is exactly as in control as it needs to be. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. I said, I need you to leave. He said, we were talking. I said, we were talking about the email. Now I need you to leave. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped next to me. He said, I still love you. I said, that doesn't matter. He said, it matters to me. I said, it's not enough. He walked out. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to the kitchen. I looked at the folder. The settlement proposal. I thought about the house and the money and the car. I thought about Lily. I thought about the San Antonio project. I thought about all the things I was going to do. I poured a glass of wine. I sat down. I looked up Holly Henson's number. I found it through Caroline's real estate website. It was in her contact list. She was listed as a client. Holly lived in San Antonio, 3 hours away. I called her the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I said, hi, Holly. This is Elena Thorne. I'm a friend of Caroline's. There was a pause. She said, Elena Thorne. The one from the video. I said, yes. She said, what do you want? I said, I need to talk to you. In person. She said, I don't think that's a good idea. I said, I think it's necessary. Your sister forwarded a hotel confirmation to you. It was for a reservation under my name. I need to know why. She said, I can't talk about that. I said, you can. Or I can come to San Antonio and talk to you there. She said, you're threatening me. I said, I'm asking you a question. She said, I don't know anything. I said, then why did she send you the confirmation? She said, she wanted me to be there. I said, at the hotel. She said, yes. I said, why? She said, she wanted a witness. I said, a witness to what? She said, to her and Peter. She wanted someone to see them together. She wanted proof. I said, proof of what? She said that he was choosing her. I said, over me. She said, yes. I sat down. I put my head in my hands. I said, she wanted you to watch. She said, she wanted me to film it. She was going to send it to you. I said, she was going to send me a video of my husband checking into a hotel with her. She said, yes. I said, that's not a witness. That's a weapon. She said, I know. I said, why are you telling me this? She said, because she's my sister. But she's wrong. And I don't want to be part of it. I said, do you still have the video? She said, no. I never made it. I didn't go to the hotel. I told her I couldn't do it. I said, when did you tell her? She said, the morning before the reservation. She was furious. She said she'd find someone else. I said she had someone else. She said, who? I said, I don't know. But someone was there. Someone filmed it. I saw the phones. There was a woman at the bar. She was holding up her phone. Holly said, that wasn't me. I said, I know. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to find out who filmed it. And then I'm going to decide what to do with that video. She said, good luck. I said, thanks. I hung up. I sat there. I thought about the woman at the bar. The one with the phone. The one who was filming. I'd seen her. She'd been there. She'd watched Caroline get escorted out. She'd filmed the whole thing. I'd been so focused on Caroline that I hadn't thought about her. Now I was. And I was going to find her. The hotel. That was the only place to start. I drove back to the hotel. The same lobby. The same marble counter. The same air conditioning. The same clock on the wall. It read 3:42. I'd been there at 4:17 the first time. I was early this time. I walked to the bar. The woman behind it was different. Younger. Blonde. She didn't recognize me. I sat down. I ordered coffee. She brought it. I said, I was here 2 weeks ago. There was a woman working the bar. Dark hair. About 40. She said, that's Marie. She's not on today. I said, when will she be on? She said, tomorrow morning. She does the early shift. I said, thank you. I left. I went home. I waited. The next morning, I was at the bar at 8 o'clock. The lobby was empty. The same blonde woman was behind the counter. I said, is Marie here? She said, she's in the back. I'll get her. She left. A few minutes later, a woman came out. Dark hair. About 40. She looked at me. She recognized me. I could see it in her face. She said, you're the one from the check-in desk. I said, yes. She said, what do you want? I said, I need to talk to you about the video. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, you were filming. I saw you. When Caroline was being escorted out. You had your phone up. She didn't say anything. She looked at the blonde woman. The blonde woman was watching. Marie said, can we talk somewhere else? I said, yes. We walked to the lobby. We sat in the same chairs I'd sat in before. The champagne bucket was gone. The table was empty. She sat across from me. She said, I didn't know who you were. I said, you know now. She said, your friend was trying to check in under your name. I figured that was something worth filming. I said, did you know her? She said, no. I said, then why did you film her? She said, because it was interesting. People love to watch things fall apart. I said, how much did you get? She said, about 3 minutes. From the time you walked up to the time they took her out. I said, did you upload it? She said, no. But someone else did. The woman at the end of the bar. She had her phone up too. She was recording the whole thing. She put it on social media. I said, do you know her name? She said, no. She was a guest. I remember her because she ordered a vodka tonic at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the kind of thing you remember. I said, do you have the video you took? She said, yes. I said, I need it. She said, why? I said, because it's my life. And I want to know what happened. She said, it's just video. I said, it's evidence. She looked at me. She was trying to decide if I was telling the truth. I was. She said, I'll send it to you. I said, thank you. She said, I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't mean to make it worse. I said, you didn't make it worse. You just recorded it. That's all anyone did. I gave her my email. She sent me the video that night. I watched it. It was exactly what I thought it would be. The lobby. The check-in desk. The clerk. Caroline's back. Me walking up. The documents. The call. Security. The escort. The revolving door. I watched it 3 times. The 3rd time, I noticed something. In the background, behind the bar, there was a man. He was sitting at the end of the bar. He had a glass of wine. He was watching. He was smiling. I didn't recognize him. I watched it again. He was definitely smiling. He was also holding a phone. He was filming too. He was filming from the other direction. He was recording the same thing. The same scene. I froze the video. I zoomed in. He was in his late 50s. Gray hair. A blue blazer. He had a glass of red wine. He looked like he belonged there. He looked like he was enjoying himself. I called the hotel. I asked for the manager. I said 2 weeks ago, there was a man at the bar. Gray hair. Blue blazer. He was there when the incident happened. He filmed it on his phone. Do you have a record of who was at the bar that day? The manager said, we don't keep records of bar guests. I said, what about the credit card receipts? He said, we could check. But it would take time. I said, please check. And please call me back. He said, I'll see what I can do. He called back 2 hours later. He said there was a man at the bar that day. He paid with an American Express card. The name on the card was James Henson. I said, James Henson. He said, yes. I said, thank you. I hung up. I sat down. James Henson. Caroline's ex-husband. The man she'd divorced 15 years ago. The father of her sons. The man she'd told me was living in Florida. The man who was supposedly remarried and out of her life. He wasn't in Florida. He was in a hotel bar. He was watching his ex-wife get escorted out of a hotel. He was filming it. He was smiling. I called Holly. I said, your ex-brother-in-law is James Henson. She said, I know. I said, did you know he was at the hotel? She said, no. I said he was. He was filming the whole thing. He sent someone the video. The video that went viral. She said he wouldn't do that. I said he did. She said he and Caroline haven't spoken in years. I said, then why was he there? She said, I don't know. I said, is there a reason he would want to hurt her? She said she cheated on him. That's why they got divorced. He never got over it. I said he took the video. He sent it to someone. That someone uploaded it. The whole thing was planned. She said, what do you mean? I said, Caroline wanted a witness. She wanted proof. She asked you to be there. You said no. She found someone else. Her ex-husband. He was at the bar. He was filming. He was waiting for it to happen. She said that doesn't make sense. I said it makes perfect sense. She wanted him to see it. She wanted him to know she'd moved on. She wanted him to know she'd found someone better. She wanted to rub it in his face. She said, and he turned it against her. I said he uploaded the video. He made sure everyone saw it. He destroyed her. She said that's sick. I said that's revenge. I sat there. I looked at my phone. I thought about the video. I thought about James Henson smiling at the bar. I thought about Caroline being escorted out. I thought about the whole thing. The plan. The counterplan. The betrayal within the betrayal. I called Margaret. I said, I need to talk to you about the recording. She said, what about it? I said, I think it's time to use it. She said, why now? I said, because I know who filmed the hotel video. It was Caroline's ex-husband. He planned the whole thing. He set her up. He made sure everyone saw her get humiliated. She said, that's a lot of information. I said, I know. She said, what do you want to do with it? I said, I want to send the recording to Caroline's brokerage. I want to send it to the ethics committee. I want to make sure they know what she did. She said, that will destroy her career. I said, she destroyed her career. I'm just giving them the evidence. She said, and Peter? I said, Peter is collateral damage. She said, he's your husband. I said, he was my husband. He's not anymore. She said, are you sure you want to do this? I said, I'm sure. She said, then I'll make the call. I hung up. I sat there. I didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not sadness. Not relief. Just emptiness. The kind of emptiness that comes after you've made a decision and there's nothing left to decide. The next day, Caroline's brokerage called. They said they'd received a complaint. They said they were launching an investigation. They said they would be interviewing Caroline. They said they might revoke her license. I said, thank you for letting me know. They said, "We're taking this seriously." I said, "I appreciate that." I hung up. I went to work. I worked on the San Antonio project. I looked at floor plans. I approved lighting fixtures. I talked to contractors. I did all the things I was supposed to do. I didn't think about Caroline. I didn't think about Peter. I just worked. That night, I went home. I made dinner. I ate alone. I went to bed. I was asleep by 10:00. I woke up at 2 o'clock. Someone was knocking on the door. I looked through the peephole. It was Peter. I opened the door. He was drunk. His eyes were red. His suit was rumpled. He'd been crying. I'd never seen him cry. Not ever. He said, "You ruined her." I said, "I protected myself." He said, "She lost her license. They're taking her license." I said, "She broke the law." He said, "She didn't break the law. She had an affair." I said, "She used your firm's connections to get listings. She used your corporate card for personal expenses. She knew what she was doing." He said, "She didn't know." I said, "She knew. You both knew." He said, "I want you to stop." I said, "I can't stop. It's already done." He said, "Then I want you to leave her alone." I said, "I am leaving her alone. I'm not doing anything else. The investigation is happening. That's not my fault." He said, "It is your fault. You recorded her. You sent it to them." I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because she had an affair with my husband. Because she used my name. Because she tried to destroy my marriage. Because she's been competing with me for 18 years and I'm tired of it. Enough is enough." He stared at me. He didn't say anything. He just stared. I said, "You need to leave." He said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "I don't want to hear it." He said, "I need to tell you." I said, "Then tell me." He said, "I didn't sleep with her." I said, "What?" He said, "I didn't sleep with her. I wanted to. I planned to. But I didn't." I said, "That's not true." He said, "It is true." I said, "Then what were you doing?" He said, "I was trying to make you jealous. I thought if you thought I was having an affair, you'd want me more." I said, "That's insane." He said, "I know." I said, "You booked a honeymoon suite. You bought her a ring." He said, "The ring was for you." I said, "What?" He said, "The ring was for you. I was going to give it to you for our anniversary. I had it in my pocket. I forgot to give it to you. Then you found it and you thought it was for her." I said, "You're lying." He said, "I'm not lying." I said, "Then why did you let me think it was for her?" He said, "Because I was embarrassed." I said, "You were embarrassed?" He said, "Yes." I said, "You're telling me you didn't have an affair." He said, "I'm telling you I didn't have an affair." I said, "Then why did you go to the hotel?" He said, "Because she was there. She wanted to meet me. I was going to tell her it was over. I didn't want to do it at the house. I wanted to do it somewhere else." I said, "You were going to break up with her?" He said, "Yes." I said, "At a honeymoon suite?" He said, "It was a hotel. I didn't care what kind of room it was. I just wanted to get it over with." I said, "And you were going to give me the ring?" He said, "I was going to give it to you on our anniversary. I had it in my pocket. I'd been carrying it for 3 weeks." I said, "You carried a ring in your pocket for 3 weeks?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And you didn't think to tell me?" He said, "I didn't know how." I sat down. I put my head in my hands. I thought about everything. The emails. The reservations. The video. The recording. The investigation. All of it. And now this. This one thing that changed everything. I said, "You didn't have an affair." He said, "No." I said, "Then what was this?" He said, "A mistake. A huge mistake. But I didn't do what you think I did." I said, "You let me believe it." He said, "I know." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I thought you'd leave me. And I didn't want you to leave me." I said, "That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard." He said, "I know." I looked at him. I looked at the man I'd been married to for 25 years. The man who'd let me think he was having an affair. The man who'd let me destroy Caroline's career. The man who'd let me move out of our bedroom. The man who'd let me think he was gone. I said, "I need you to leave." He said, "Elena." I said, "Please leave." He left. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table. I looked at the ring box. The one I'd found in his pocket. The one I'd thought was for Caroline. I opened it. I looked at the ring. It was beautiful. It was exactly what I would have picked out. He'd picked it out. He'd picked it out for me. I put the box down. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. I just sat there, in the dark, looking at the ring and wondering who I'd become. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up. The ring box was still in front of me. I opened it one more time. The diamond caught the morning light. It was a good ring. A real one. Not a prop. Not a lie. He'd picked it out. He'd carried it in his pocket for 3 weeks. He'd been going to give it to me. I closed the box. I put it in the drawer. I went to work. The San Antonio project was moving fast. Rachel had approved the initial design. I had contractors lined up. I had permits pending. I had a schedule. I had something to do that wasn't thinking about Peter. I was in a meeting with a supplier when my phone buzzed. Margaret. I stepped out. I called her back. She said the investigation at Caroline's brokerage is moving forward. They've suspended her license pending review. She's filed a grievance against you. I said, what kind of grievance? She said she's accusing you of using a recording illegally. She's saying you obtained it without her consent. I said I did. She said, I know. That's the problem. I said, what do we do? She said, we get a lawyer for you. Someone who handles this kind of thing. I said, I have you. She said, I'm a divorce attorney. This is criminal law. I can't represent you in this. I said, so I need someone else. She said, yes. I know a woman. Her name is Sarah Klein. She's good. She's expensive. But she's good. I said, get her. She said, I'll have her call you. Sarah Klein called me that afternoon. She said, Margaret told me what's happening. I need to ask you some questions. I said, ask. She said, did you record Caroline without her knowledge? I said, yes. She said, did she know you were recording? I said, no. She said, then we have a problem. I said, I know. She said, Texas is a one-party consent state. That means as long as you're part of the conversation, you can record it. The question is whether you were part of it or whether you were a bystander. I said, I was part of it. She was talking to me. I was asking her questions. She said, what did you ask? I said, I asked her if she was sleeping with my husband. She said, yes. She said, that's a crime. She admitted to a crime. I said, it's not a crime to have an affair. She said, it's a crime to admit to it on a recording. No. That's not the issue. The issue is what you did with the recording. You sent it to her employer. That's not illegal. It's just not a good look. I said, so what do we do? She said, we wait. We see what she does. And we don't send any more recordings to anyone. I said, okay. I hung up. I went back to my meeting. I didn't tell anyone about Peter's confession. I didn't tell Margaret. I didn't tell Lily. I didn't tell Sarah. I kept it to myself. I wasn't sure what it meant. I wasn't sure if I believed it. Lily called that night. She said, Dad called me. I said, what did he say? She said, he told me he didn't have an affair. I said, he told me the same thing. She said, do you believe him? I said, I don't know. She said, he sounded like he was telling the truth. He sounded desperate. I said, he was desperate. She said, Mom, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. She said, I want you to be happy. I said, I know. She said, whatever you decide, I'm on your side. I said, thank you. I hung up. I sat in the dark. I thought about Peter. I thought about the ring. I thought about the hotel. I thought about the video. I thought about Caroline. I thought about all of it. And I realized something. I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd spent 25 years being Peter's wife. I'd been Elena Thorne, the interior designer. I'd been Lily's mother. I'd been the woman who threw dinner parties and managed the household and took care of Peter's mother. I'd been all those things. But I didn't know who I was without them. I went to the closet. I looked at the box in the attic. The one with all the photos of Peter. I'd put them there. I'd told myself I'd decide later. I opened the box. I looked at the photos. Our wedding. Lily's birth. Vacations. Birthdays. Anniversaries. All of it. 25 years of memories. I closed the box. I put it back. I didn't throw it away. I didn't keep it out. I just left it there. The next week was quiet. No calls from Peter. No messages from Caroline. No updates from the brokerage. Nothing. It was the quiet I'd been asking for. And it was terrifying. I went to work. I came home. I ate dinner alone. I went to bed alone. I did all the things I was supposed to do. But I felt like I was floating. Like I was watching someone else's life. I didn't know how to make it stop. I went to see Rachel at her office. I told her I needed to talk. She said, "What's wrong?" I told her everything. The affair. The hotel. The recording. The investigation. Peter's confession. All of it. I didn't leave anything out. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I was done, she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "You know. You just don't want to say it." I said, "I think I want to leave him." She said, "Then leave him." I said, "But what if he was telling the truth?" She said, "Does it matter?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "If he was telling the truth, he still let you believe he was having an affair. He still let you go through all of this. He still let you destroy someone else's career. He still let you think you were losing your marriage. He did all of that. Even if he didn't sleep with her, he did all of that." I said, "I know." She said, "So what difference does it make?" I said, "It makes a difference because I don't want to leave him if I was wrong." She said, "You weren't wrong. He was wrong. You just didn't know the full story. That doesn't make you wrong." I said, "I sent the recording to Caroline's brokerage. I ruined her life." She said, "She ruined her own life. She had an affair with your husband. She tried to check into a hotel under your name. She tried to humiliate you. She got what she deserved." I said, "What about Peter?" She said, "What about him?" I said, "I still love him." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't know if I can leave him." She said, "You can. You just don't want to." I said, "That's not true." She said, "It is true. You're scared. That's okay. But you need to decide. Are you going to stay with him because you love him, or are you going to leave because you need to?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Then figure it out." I left her office. I went home. I sat in the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the ring box. I opened it. I looked at the ring. I looked at the diamond. I looked at the band. It was simple. Elegant. Perfect. I put the ring on my finger. It fit. It fit perfectly. He'd known my size. He'd remembered. After 25 years, he'd remembered. I took it off. I put it back in the box. I closed the drawer. I called Margaret. I said, "I need to know about the separation." She said, "What about it?" I said, "Can I stop it?" She said, "You can. But you have to ask yourself why you want to." I said, "I don't want to stop it. I just need to know if I can." She said, "You can. But I don't think you should." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because you've been working too hard to get to where you are. You have the house. You have the money. You have the project. You have your own life. Why would you want to go back?" I said, "Because I love him." She said, "Love isn't enough. It's never enough. There has to be trust. There has to be respect. There has to be honesty." He failed at all of those things. Even if he didn't sleep with her, he failed at all of them. I said, "I know." She said, "Then what do you want to do?" I said, "I want to stay separated. But I don't want to file for divorce yet." She said, "That's a good decision." I said, "Is it?" She said, "It's a decision. That's what matters." I hung up. I went to the guest room. I lay down on the bed. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about Peter. I thought about Caroline. I thought about the video. I thought about the ring. I thought about all of it. And I realized something. I didn't need to decide everything right now. I just needed to decide what to do next. The next morning, Peter came to the house. He had a key. He used it. I was in the kitchen. I heard him come in. I didn't move. He walked to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. He said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to apologize." I said, "For what?" He said, "For everything. For the hotel. For Caroline. For not telling you the truth. For letting you believe something that wasn't true." I said, you did all of that. He said, I know. I said, why? He said, because I was afraid. I was afraid you'd leave me. I said, you made me leave you. He said, I know. I said, you made me think you were having an affair. You made me think you were going to leave me for her. You made me think I was losing everything. He said, I know. I said, why did you do it? He said, because I wanted your attention. I wanted you to see me. I wanted you to fight for me. I said, I would have fought for you if you'd asked. He said, I didn't think you would. I said, then you don't know me at all. He sat down. He put his head in his hands. He said, I know I ruined everything. I said, you did. He said, I don't know how to fix it. I said, you can't fix it. You can't unring a bell. You can't undo what you did. All you can do is decide what to do next. He said, what should I do next? I said, I don't know. That's your decision. Not mine. He looked at me. He said, do you still love me? I said, yes. He said, then why won't you give me a chance? I said, because love isn't enough. It's not enough to fix what you broke. It's not enough to make me trust you again. It's not enough to make me forget. He said, I'll do anything. I said, I don't want you to do anything. I want you to leave. He said, what? I said, I want you to leave. I want you to go back to wherever you've been staying. I want you to give me space. I want you to let me figure out what I want. He said, I don't want to leave. I said, I know. But you need to. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. He said, I love you. I said, I know. He left. I sat down. I put my head in my hands. I didn't cry. I'd used up all my tears. I just sat there. In the quiet. In the house that was mine. In the life that was mine. And I started to figure out what came next. The next 2 weeks were quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones. I went to work. I came home. I talked to Lily. I talked to Rachel. I didn't talk to Peter. He didn't call. He didn't come to the house. He respected the space I'd asked for. I wasn't sure if that made it easier or harder. The San Antonio project was moving. I'd hired a new assistant. A young woman named Maya. She was 26 and sharp, and she asked the right questions. She didn't know about Peter. She didn't need to. She just needed to know about tile samples and millwork and lighting plans. I gave her all of that. Caroline's license was suspended. I saw it in the news. A brief article in the real estate section. Local agent under investigation. It didn't mention me. It didn't mention Peter. It just mentioned the suspension. I read it and felt nothing. I'd made a decision. I was going to stay separated. I was going to keep the house. I was going to keep the money. I was going to keep the project. I was going to keep my life. Peter could have whatever was left. I didn't care. But I still loved him. I couldn't stop that. I'd spent 25 years loving him. That didn't disappear because he'd made a mistake. It was still there. It was just buried under everything else. I was in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. I was making coffee. The doorbell rang. I opened the door. It was Peter. He looked different. He looked like he'd been sleeping. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. The ones I'd bought him. He looked like he was trying to be comfortable. He looked like he was trying to be someone else. He said, "Can I come in?" I said yes. He walked in. He went to the kitchen. He sat at the table. I stood at the counter. I didn't sit. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said." I said, "What did I say?" He said, "You said love isn't enough. You said there has to be trust and respect and honesty. I didn't give you any of those things." I said, "No, you didn't." He said, "I want to try." I said, "Try what?" He said, "I want to try to earn your trust back. I want to try to earn your respect. I want to try to be honest." I said, "How?" He said, "I'll start by telling you everything. The whole truth. No more lies. No more omissions. Everything." I said, "Go ahead." He took a breath. He said, "I met Caroline 3 years ago at a work event. She was representing a seller. I was representing a buyer. We had dinner. We talked. She was interesting. She was different from you." I said, "Different how?" He said, "She was more interested in me. She asked questions. She wanted to know about my life. She made me feel like I mattered." I said, "I made you feel like you mattered." He said, "You did." But it was different. You'd been making me feel that way for 20 years. It was automatic. With her, it was new. It was exciting. I said, so you started an affair? He said, no. I didn't start an affair. I started a conversation. She called me. We talked. We talked about work. We talked about our lives. She listened. I listened. It was just talking. I said, for how long? He said, a year. We talked for a year. Then she told me she wanted more. She said she was falling in love with me. I said, what did you say? He said, I said I was married. I said I couldn't do that. I said, but you did. He said, no. I didn't. I told her I wasn't going to leave you. I told her I loved you. I told her she was a friend. That's all. I said, then why did you go to the hotel? He said, because she threatened me. I said, what? He said she was going to tell you. She said she was going to send you the emails. She said she was going to tell everyone. She said she'd make sure you knew. I said, why would she do that? He said, because she wanted to hurt me. She wanted to punish me for not choosing her. She wanted to destroy my marriage so she could have me. I said, and you believed her. He said, I knew her. I knew what she was capable of. I'd seen it in her ex-husband. She'd done the same thing to him. She'd threatened to destroy him. She did. I said, so you went to the hotel to stop her? He said, yes. I was going to tell her it was over. I was going to tell her I'd never been with her. I was going to tell her she was crazy. I was going to walk away. I said, and then I showed up. He said, and then you showed up. I sat down. I looked at him. I said, you didn't have an affair. He said, no. I said, you were never with her. He said, no. I said, she lied. She lied about everything. He said, yes. I said, she told me you were in love with her. He said, I know. I said, she made me believe you were going to leave me. He said, I know. I said, she made me believe you were having an affair for a year. He said, I know. I said, and you let me believe it. He said, I didn't have a choice. If I'd told you the truth, she would have sent you the emails. She would have made it look like I was the one who was lying. I said, she did that anyway. He said, I know. I said, I ruined her career. He said, she ruined her own career. I said, I sent a recording to her brokerage. I destroyed her license. He said, she threatened to destroy our marriage. She did it anyway. She got what she deserved. I said, I didn't know. He said, I know. I said, you could have told me. He said, I was afraid. I said, of what? He said, of losing you. I said, you already lost me. He said, I know. He sat there. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. I looked at him. I thought about everything. The emails. The reservation. The hotel. The video. The recording. The ring. All of it. It was all because of Caroline. She'd made me believe something that wasn't true. She'd made me hurt him. She'd made me hurt myself. I said, what do you want from me? He said, I want you to forgive me. I said, for what? He said, for not telling you the truth. For letting you believe something that wasn't true. For being too scared to tell you what was happening. I said, what about Caroline? He said, what about her? I said, are you going to see her again? He said, no. I said, are you going to talk to her? He said, no. I said, are you going to let her destroy us? He said, no. I said, then what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to be better. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to earn your trust back. I'm going to earn your respect. I'm going to be the husband you deserve. I said, that's a big promise. He said, I know. I said, I don't know if I can trust you. He said, I know. I said, I don't know if I can forget what happened. He said, I know. I said, I don't know if I can forgive you. He said, I know. I sat there. I looked at him. I thought about everything. I thought about the years we'd had. I thought about the years we could have. I thought about Lily. I thought about the house. I thought about the ring. I said, I need time. He said, I'll give you time. I said, I need space. He said, I'll give you space. I said, I need to figure out what I want. He said, I'll wait. I said, what if I decide I don't want you? He said, then I'll accept it. I'll leave. I'll go. I'll let you live your life. I said, you'd do that. He said, I'd do anything for you. I said, I know. I stood up. I walked to the drawer. I opened it. I took out the ring box. I opened it. I looked at the ring. I looked at Peter. I said, you bought this for me. He said, yes. I said, you carried it in your pocket for 3 weeks. He said, yes. I said, you were going to give it to me on our anniversary. He said, yes. I said, why? He said, because I love you. Because I've always loved you. Because I made a mistake, and I wanted to make it right. I said, is that what this ring is? A way to make it right? He said, it's a symbol. A symbol of my commitment. A symbol of my love. A symbol of my apology. I said, I don't want a symbol. He said, what do you want? I said, I want you to leave. He said, what? I said, I want you to leave. I want you to go back to wherever you've been staying. I want you to think about what you've done. I want you to think about who you want to be. And then I want you to come back and tell me. He said, I don't understand. I said, I need to see that you've changed. I need to see that you're not just saying what I want to hear. I need to see that you're willing to do the work. He said, I'll do the work. I said, then start now. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. He said, I'll come back. I said, I know. He said, I love you. I said, I know. He left. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table. I put the ring box in front of me. I opened it. I looked at the ring. I thought about everything. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if I was going to forgive him. I didn't know if I was going to leave him. I didn't know if I was going to keep the ring. I didn't know anything. But I knew one thing. I was going to be okay. I was going to survive this. I was going to keep going. I was going to live my life. I was going to be happy. I was going to be free. I closed the ring box. I put it in the drawer. I walked to the back door. I opened it. I stepped onto the porch. I looked out at the garden. The overgrown one. The one I'd been meaning to fix for years. I looked at the fountain. The one I'd had shipped from Italy. The center point of the yard. The center point of my life. I looked at it. I thought about all the things I'd done. All the things I'd survived. All the things I'd become. I said it out loud. I kept the champagne. I smiled. I walked back inside. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I drank it black. I looked out the window at the garden. I thought about what I was going to do with it. I thought about the fountain. I thought about the flowers. I thought about the grass. I thought about Peter. I thought about Caroline. I thought about all of it. I thought about the ending. The one I'd written for myself. The one I'd chosen. I thought about the ring. The ring he'd bought for me. The ring I hadn't put on. The ring I'd put in the drawer. The ring I could put on tomorrow. Or the day after that. Or never. I decided I'd decide later. That was the point. I got to decide. Not him. Not her. Not anyone else. Just me. I finished my coffee. I put the cup in the sink. I went to my office. I opened my laptop. I looked at the San Antonio project. I started working. I didn't look back. I kept the champagne.